Thank you very much for the talk. Your voice reminds me of Heidegger's voice.
Sorry?
No, I'm kidding. My question is, well, from your kind of synthetic reading of Heidegger and the Stigler, what do you think? What do you think that how can it be possible to think about the technological condition or the organological condition of clearing? Let's assume that the question of clearing is still worth asking and is still valid to be posed as such. Now, because this question, for me, I think there's two points here. The first thing is there's a similarity between Sloterdijk and Heidegger, and the second is the difference between Sloterdijk and the Stigler. Now, the similarity of Sloterdijk and Heidegger lies on the fact that there was one example you talk about is the geviert. How do you translate it?
The fourfold, I guess, yeah.
And where, because that there is in Sloterdijk used this example of the house, but there was when you mention, or when many people talk about the fourfold, there's always something which is forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
Is the jug. The jug. You know, this thing that you use to drink wine. I think
the jug.
The jug, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's translated as a jug
in
English.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, because that is also a technical object, and that is the possibility only come out this curing, like for Heidegger, this can only come out of the meditation on the technical object, and that is kind of forgotten in this relation. And the second thing is the difference from Sloterdijk and Stigler, and because I think that from Sloterdijk's writing on the human park, and then his collaboration with Thomas Macher, and then until now the development of the discipline that they call the Kulturtechnik in Germany. There is a problem for me that they don't. Of course, the clearing, like Aristotle, has so much to do with technique, but there is no articulation on the technical condition or not technical, but organological condition of Aristotle itself. You see what I mean? So techniques become the ontological, maybe we say ontological condition of Aristotle, but there is. But under what condition is this Aristotle possible?
I think for Heidegger the Lichtung is unconditional, but maybe when you talked about the jug in Heidegger's geviert or fourfold thinking, there the technical object is indeed that which bedings the Lichtung. So in the technical object itself, the Lichtung or the geviert comes to be. So technical objects become in a certain way conditioners for the Lichtung, which the earlier Heidegger thought of as being, an original gift, something that was totally unconditional, more kind of a revelation. But in a later Heidegger, things, I think he won't call them technical objects. Things as, those things which gather the fourfold are indeed conditioning the Lichtung as something that he earlier thought of as being unconditioned. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah. So, okay. Pieter, if I could, it was only a tangential piece of what you said with regard to neoteny, but I want to come back to it anyway because I think it's an interesting contrast that we get between Stigler and various other figures like Lacan, but also exposes a limitation of Sloterdijk, which is to say that the habitual understanding of neoteny that comes from someone like Lacan is that the symbolic order comes into existence because of neoteny, as a kind of substitution or a compensation for it. But actually, with regard to a more Stiglerian thinking, we might rather suggest that neoteny is only possible because there is already artificial selection, both at the level of gene culture coevolution and also at the level of epiphylogenesis. So in other words, we've got two kinds of artificial selection at stake here. One is the sense in which anthropology and sociobiology do conventionally talk about it, namely an artificial environment permits the selection of certain kinds of genes, and then the other version of artificial selection is Stiegler's, which is not to do with the selection of genes, but to do with the organization of the cortex instead. And it strikes me as being a kind of an interesting hole in contemporary biology, but no one ever really talks about the extent to which, in order for neotenic babies to survive, you really need to have some kind of social situation that is in place in order for them not to die. In other words, you already have to have a system of care and some kind of symbolic order in place, not necessarily particularly developed, because you get neoteny in pretty much every species, including dogs, but in humans we know, for example, or in hominins at least, we know that it begins at least with Australopithecines. So there's a long history of the kind of the coevolution of neotenic biology and kind of nascent symbolic order as well. But anyway, just to kind of come back to the bigger point, which is doesn't this tell us something interesting about the difference between Stiegler and Sloterdijk, namely that Sloterdijk, for all his potential to be worked into a theory of epiphylogenesis, doesn't tell us about the other kind of artificial selection, as far as I can tell, namely gene culture coevolution. And doesn't that leave a huge hole in what he's doing?
I think, well, Sloterdijk adds to Stiegler's epiphylogenesis. I think within the process of anthropogenesis, there are many causalities, a whole complex of causalities that play into it. And I think the epiphylogenetic account of Stiegler is only one mechanism, whereas the mechanism of pampering or unburdening of the organs, which Sloterdijk has, of course, from Galen, is another mechanism in a way that helps us to understand how the human came into being, but also how the clearing came into being. But I don't know if this is an answer to your question. Is it or isn't it?
Thank you, Peter. We will continue this discussion with Sloterdijk normally.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
In 1 year. I just wanted first to tell you, but you know that, I believe, but not anybody, that I began my seminar last spring by an opening a dialogue with Sloterdijk concerning what he calls anthropotechnique. Now I would like just to precise here what are my problems with Sloterdijk, my main problems, because I have several problems, but politically particularly. But the main questions in his interpretation of Zion Zeit is that, if I understood correctly what he did, because I didn't read all the books by Sloterdijk, he opposed to the question of time in Zion Zeit the question of space. And this is the topic of sphere. But I don't believe that it is sufficient to oppose. It's not exactly an opposition, but to object, let's say, that the prior question is space. It is a very important question for myself. This is what I would like to explain to Smith, that exteriorization and spatialization is the beginning, precisely for me, of the opening of Lichtung. But I think the opposition between space and time is metaphysical. And the first one who says that is Aristotle, who says the dialectician needs to make an opposition between space and time, but it's always, it doesn't say metaphysical, but it is always the failure of the dialectician. We can't do in another way, but it's a limit of thought. And, I think the main question with Heidegger read through Sloterdijk and Derrida is to overcome this opposition between space and time, and this is for me the question of speed, which is at stake. That is of reason too. And an organology must necessarily become an organology not of time, but of time in space, that is, speed. And the other question is, the other problem for me is the question of speed becoming also the one of entropy. Just precise it. And I believe that a discussion with Sloterdijk concerning negentropy should be extremely interesting. Now, the other problem for me, which is also a political one, is the question of desire and psychoanalysis. I believe that the discourse of Sloterdijk concerning Freud, Lacan, narcissism, etc., is wrong. And he makes confusion himself between desire, drives, etc., disinhibition, and all those questions. And it is particularly clear in Le Palais de Cristal. I don't know the Crystal Palace. It is particularly clear, and it is a kind of legitimation of capitalism. So I believe here there is a big problem, but it is linked to the question of space for me.
Yeah, I think that Sloterdijk says he wants to, whereas Heidegger wrote an ontochronology, ontology as an ontochronology, he wants to elaborate an ontotopology. But I don't think that he opposes this ontotopology to an ontochronology. He says it's more of an elaboration, what Heidegger called Einräumen, but Heidegger doesn't explicate the spatial phenomenon of Dasein in Sein und Zeit. But I don't think he opposes chronology and topology.
I wouldn't say that he opposes, but he says the privilege is the privilege of space.
Yeah.
And so the privilege of time in Sein und Zeit.
Yeah. Although he shows also in his Heidegger book how human temporality, the temporality of the Dasein, somehow emerges from within this, within this immunospheric existence. So again, it's not an opposition, I guess. But yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And now, especially, I'm ashamed to admit that this is a somewhat selfish question. But I'm thinking here of another reader of this material, and specifically Giorgio Agamben.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about this because one of the elements of the pharmacon, which we haven't developed as fully as other, involves this issue of the scapegoat, of the sacrifice, and the putting in place of the substitute, as it were. And that seems to me to be very much part of the reading that Agamben provides. He's trying to think about the animal as falling into that space, shared with Homo sacer, the one who can be sacrificed without, any kind of residue of transcendental significance arising. So that there's a kind of element in here that has to do with, in the Derridian vocabulary, the sort of ontology of the carnivore, of the eating of the animal that sustains the relationship between the human and animal. Do you feel that there is any element, given the place that you've put, or the emphasis that you've put on the pharmacological in thinking about Lichtung, is there a place here for beginning to introduce that kind of conversation into how we're thinking about the energy that is sustaining this Dasein that thinks its relation in opposition to the animal, which it can sacrifice?
Sorry, I can't answer this question. I think of course I know Agamben's interpretation of Heidegger in the open, but what I never managed to understand is that he does not, in any sense, open an evolutionary perspective on anthropogenesis. It's something that happens in a way. It's I don't get it. I wanted to say something about it in this talk, but for me it's totally incomprehensible in a way. So, and I'm not familiar with Agamben, so sorry.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Pieter Lemmens for his lecture.
Thank you.